Okay, so welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars webinar. My name is Matthew. Excuse me, my name is Matthew. I'm an instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star, and this will be the third class in our ongoing series of 12 classes on the paths, letters, excuse me, on the paths, letters, and correspondences. So our first class was sort of an introduction. We did an overview some of the ideas of correspondences. Looked at a kind of few different traditions over the course of going back from like ancient Greece into the Renaissance and then into the modern world, looking at the way that correspondences were talked about, how the Hebrew alphabet got sort of involved in that, and why the Hebrew letters are one of our primary kind of anchor points, which all the other correspondences and different symbols kind of constellate around. We talked about a lot of that. And then last week, so for last week, this week, and the next week, we're kind of following the Sefer Yetzirah sort of pattern of breaking up the Hebrew alphabet into the three kind of main divisions of single mother letters, double letters, and single letters. And so last week we looked at the three mother letters of Aleph, Mem, and Shin. And we also looked at the elements. Aleph, Mem, and Shin correspond with air, water, and fire. And then we also talked about how earth and spirit can come in and be associated with the Hebrew alphabet and with the paths. We talked a little bit about 777 and how to read the lines of correspondence in 777. So this week we'll be continuing on with that pattern, and we'll be looking at the planets and the 7 double letters. So, oh, here we go. Yeah, sorry, I had to change the way I did my slides here because of the issues that were going on. But can you see that now? Okay. All right, so yeah, here's the Hebrew alphabet, just for your review. As I said last week, I'm going to sort of mostly assume that people can recognize the letters by shape. I'll try to include and name them when we go through. But for the most part, yeah, I hope you can recognize them. But feel free to jump in if you have questions or or get confused or anything like that. Let's see. Yeah, so this is where this is the kind of main set of correspondences that we've been using here. These are derived from the cipher manuscripts, but I've kind of edited it so that the correspondences for He, the star and Aquarius, and the correspondences for Zadi, being the emperor, and Aries, that those match the thelemic uses based on Crowley's understanding of what he received in the Book of the Law. So this is what we'll be working from today. And here's our division into the three mother letters, or three sets of letters. The mother letters of Aleph, Mem, and Shin. The double letters, reading from right to left here, there's Beth, Gimel, Daleth, Kaf, Pei, Resh, and Tav. And then we've got our 12 single letters. I put elemental in quotation marks there because in some of the Hebrew texts, they're called the elemental letters. But that's sort of confusing for us because we think of the elements like the 4 elements. It's just that word being used in a different sense, to mean basic or whatever. But it's important to know that usage exists. So today we'll be focusing on the 7 double letters, the middle group there. Let's see, before we jump right into it, I wanted to just sort of follow up on a couple of kind of ongoing trains of thought about correspondences and how to use them and how to think about them. So a couple of things. First of all, I just wanted to sort of revisit this idea again that we talked about last week, coming out of the Jewish esoteric tradition and magical traditions, of the idea that Hebrew is the language of creation, and that the Hebrew letters themselves are imbued with a creative and magical power. And I think that's important to sort of keep in mind, and for understanding why Hebrew becomes what it does for the Western esoteric tradition. I mean, obviously, the Old Testament, for Christian Kabbalah, was originally written in Hebrew, and so that makes it just sort of important for the tradition in that sense. And even in Hermetic Kabbalah, which is sort of no longer Christian or Jewish, still, a lot of the basic vocabulary and the basic symbols are all derived from the Hebrew Bible. So, that's just sort of part of the DNA. But there's also this thing about the Hebrew letters, the Hebrew alphabet, the Hebrew words, having a special sort of creative power. And we can be as kind of skeptical about the actual reality of that as we want to be, but I think that is sort of built into the symbolism of it, and sort of myth. Even if we want to take it as a myth rather than as a literal truth, I think it is important to keep that in mind. That these things are supposed to be a creative language, and that the letters themselves are imbued with a divine and creative power, and that by manipulating, and since the divinity used or utilized these letters in creating the universe, there's a Kabbalistic traditions talking about the Torah not just as God's sort of revelation to humanity, but as the actual pattern on which everything is built. There's even ideas of different versions of the Torah existing in different cycles of creation and all this. And so I think all this is, again, we don't have to believe that that's true about the Torah or any other text, but I think all these ideas remain present and are kind of important mythical reference points. And so when we're utilizing Hebrew, thinking of it or conceiving of it in some way or other as this sort of symbolic language of creation and of divine power is really important. And when we talk about so the way that some of the techniques for working with the letters, sort of permuting them and looking at them in different combinations and things like that, I think that stuff makes a lot more sense if you're coming at it from the background of them having a kind of an inherent creative power. One other thing I wanted to mention, this was something that someone that I was talking to earlier this week brought up to me, and I was really glad that he did mention this, which is that one way of thinking about why correspondences are important and why it's important to learn them and to really internalize them as part of one of the kind of preliminary stages on the magical path, is that not only is the magical these sets of correspondences in the Hebrew alphabet a language for magicians to talk to each other, or for magicians, to talk to spirits or other sort of powers, but it's also a way for the conscious mind to relate to the unconscious. There's a lot of teachings, especially in kind of 20th and 21st, or into 21st century Hermetic tradition that talks about a symbol being something like the language of the unconscious. And that our unconscious mind communicates in symbol. And so one way we could think of this is that it's giving us a kind of language through which we can talk to the unconscious mind. Now, this is both kind of the lower unconscious, the personal unconscious, what in Kabbalistic psychology is called the nefesh. And then that also is related to the higher unconscious, we call the neshama. In Kabbalistic psychology, what in sort of Jungian psychology is something like the collective unconscious, or people talking about the spiritual unconscious, something like that. The higher unconscious, which itself is often thought to communicate to the conscious mind, to the ego, by means of the lower unconscious, so through dreams, through intuitions, and things like that. And so by consciously learning these things and then letting how deeply ingrained these symbols are in our minds become unconscious knowledge by fully internalizing them, it gives us a language to be able to communicate with the unconscious. We can, by meditating on these symbols and things like that, we can sort of convey an intention to the unconscious forces. And by listening to the unconscious, through dreams and things like that, those forces can also use the same set of symbols to communicate back to the conscious mind. So it's also kind of an interface tool between different levels of our consciousness. And again, this is something that you could be sort of entirely skeptical about. You could think that this is just an arbitrary set of symbols, and it would still work. It would still make sense. And so, on that basis, there's nothing that you need to sort of believe in order to be able to use this system. Now, you may find, in practice and in your study and things like that, that you do think that it's more than just an arbitrary set of conventions, but that's not necessary to begin working with these things. And that's an attitude you'll see Crowley sort of takes a lot. Sometimes you'll see Crowley kind of giving explanations for things or for why things are done, but being really, really kind of hard what's the word I'm looking for? Finding very like kind of almost materialistic kind of explanations for why these things are valuable. And it's not, I think, that Crowley actually believes that that's the only thing valuable about it. He's just saying, look, even the most sort of scientifically material-minded person could still find value in them. And so, you should do them. And then once you start doing them, you kind of have experiences and encounter things. And then maybe your ideas or opinions can change. So anyways, I think that's just another important way to think about the importance of these things, is as a way of communicating between different levels of consciousness and programming ourselves with these symbols to be able to do that. And then, manipulating them for all kinds of, magical and meditative purposes. Okay, so like I said, we'll be talking about the 7 double letters here. So here on the list of correspondences from the cipher manuscript, the colors don't mean anything here, just like last week. But I've just sort of highlighted the 3 different groups of letters just so you can see them. So that's the mother letters are in red there. The double letters, the ones we'll be talking about today, are in green. And then the single letters corresponding to the signs of the zodiac are in blue. So we're looking at the green lines here today. And you'll see it's kind of interesting the way that they work out, where you've got 3 at the top for Beth, Gimel, and Daleth, and then Kaf in the center, and then sort of Pei, Resh, and Tav down towards the bottom. So you've kind of got this upper group of 3, lower group of 3, and then 1 in the middle. That's not particularly important for any of this. It's just something I just thought was interesting. Okay, yeah, so let's just jump right into it with the Sefer Yetzirah. We'll be looking at chapter 4 of Sefer Yetzirah today, and I'm using Aria Kaplan's translation, just like last week. So we got the Hebrew and then the English translation. Okay, so 7 doubles: Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, Resh, Tav. They direct themselves with 2 tongues: Bet, Vet, Gimel, Jimel, Daleth, Thaleth, Kaf, Chaf, Pei, Fei, Resh, Tav, Thav. A structure of soft and hard, strong and weak. Okay, so let's say a few things about this. First of all, in the spellings of the letters, you'll see I tend to say Beth and to spell the letter B-E-T-H. Others, this is a kind of Hebrew dialect thing. You'll see it sometimes as Bet. And again, that's about whether the Tav there is being given a hard or a soft pronunciation. So you just kind of have to get used to that. Same thing with like the letter Kaf. Like when I write it, I'll spell it K-A-P-H rather than K-A-F. It's just that there's no standard for transliterating Hebrew into English. So this is kind of what a lot of more modern like scholarly and Jewish literature spells it. The way I tend to spell them is the way that kind of the esoteric tradition has been spelling them since like the 19th century. So you just need to get used to seeing variations there. Okay, now this thing about they direct themselves with 2 tongues. The idea of the basic idea with the double letters is that they have 2 pronunciations: a hard pronunciation and a soft pronunciation. There's a few kind of things here we can, let me see. So the first thing to be aware of is that the double pronunciations of these letters haven't survived in all like contemporary forms of Hebrew, in dialects of Hebrew, like Ashkenazic, Sephardic, the pronunciations have changed. And so some of the double letters have now only have a single pronunciation. Some retain their doubles, and then different Hebrew dialects retain sort of different sets of those things. The one that there's actually sort of a question about whether there was ever 2 pronunciations is Resh. Some Hebrew scholars have thought that there was an ancient double second pronunciation for Resh, but there's not really any evidence for what that pronunciation would have been. But for the other 6, there is definitely a clear sort of hard and soft pronunciation. So the hard Beth or Bet is a B sound, and the soft Bet is a V sound. Hard Gimel is a G sound, and soft Gimel is like kind of a J sound, more or less. Hard Dalet is a D sound, and the soft Dalet is kind of a hard TH. So the hard TH is like the th in the rather than the th in like thing. So yeah, so the, not, so it's the, not th, if that makes sense. So that's the hard and soft. So hard pronunciation of Dalet is the D, and then the soft pronunciation of Dalet is what we would call like a soft, or a hard TH is the soft pronunciation of Dalet. Okay, let's see, we got a question here. Yeah, so for at least 6 of the letters, good question, Chad. He's asking about this idea about whether they were historic. The one that there's the question about is Resh. The other 6 definitely have historical double pronunciations. Okay, so cough and cough. The hard cough is like a K sound. The soft cough is a difficult sound for me to make. It's sort of like a German CH, like in Loch, or yeah, difficult sound for me, kind of a deeper guttural sound. That's the hard and soft, but the hard sound is like a K sound. All right, and then with pay, the hard sound is a P, and the soft sound is sometimes rendered as a PH or often as an F. And then again, for resh, we only have that one sound. There's not known to have ever been a second sound for resh, though again, some Hebrew scholars and rabbis have thought that there was actually an ancient pronunciation that's been completely lost there. That's obviously an open question. Some even actually interpret that. I'm using some of the correspondences of the letter resh and saying that, because of things that, sort of humanity has lost over time, that's why we lost the second pronunciation and all this kind of stuff. And then with tav, there's some variations in different dialects in how the hard and soft is pronounced. The hard is usually just a T sound, and then the soft is often a TH, though I think in at least one dialect, the soft is now the S sort of sound, but it's usually like a hard T or a TH. This is noted, or a couple, again, I'm not any kind of Hebrew scholar here, but I'll just note a couple of things. One is that at the beginning of words, you're generally using the hard pronunciation. Another thing is that there's a mark, I was going to include an image and I forgot to bring it in. There's a mark called the dagesh, which is just sort of a dot placed at the center of a letter. And the presence of that dot shows that it's a hard pronunciation. And so I think there's like 10 words in the Bible. A couple of those words appear more than once, but I think it's 10 distinct words that actually do have a resh with the dagesh sign in them, which might indicate, obviously in the oldest versions of the Hebrew Bible, there's no, that kind of pointing isn't there. But it does appear in some versions. So yeah, I'm not an expert on that, but that's just a little bit of the background there. But for our purposes here, we're going to be considering all of these to be, all 7, to be doubles. And the idea of sort of 2 modes of expression is important for their symbolism. Okay, so we're just going to move on from there. So verse 2, 7 doubles: Beth, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, Resh, Tav. Their foundation is wisdom, wealth, seed, life, dominance, peace, and grace. So we've got 7 qualities that are going to be associated with these letters. Now, the way that these qualities get attributed, we're not going to get too deep into the way that these qualities get attributed to the letters because, well, for a few different reasons. One is that how that happens varies a lot in different versions of the Sefer Yetzirah. Normally what happens is the qualities just get attributed in like alphabetical order. So the first one goes to Beth, the second one goes to Gimel, third one goes to Daleth. But the order that the qualities appear here, that varies in different versions of the Sefer Yetzirah. I've seen some kind of Hermetic Kabbalists follow the ordering that's found in like the short version of the Sefer Yetzirah, but I've never seen any particularly useful application of that. And once we bring in the kind of Hermetic Kabbalistic planetary attributions to the letters, then it starts to really not, a few of them work well, but the others don't fit that great. And it's not a super important part of the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, but it's just important to be aware of them. And then in the third verse here, we see 7 doubles, Beth, Gimel, Daleth, Kaf, Pei, Resh, Tav, in speech and in transposition. The transpose of wisdom is folly. The transpose of wealth is poverty. The transpose of seed is desolation. The transpose of life is death. The transpose of dominance is subjugation. The transpose of peace is war. The transpose of grace is ugliness. So again, these are the sort of double powers of each letter. You could almost think of it having like a kind of direct expression and then something like maybe like a more of a shadow expression. The first quality there, the more sort of positive seeming qualities, those are generally associated with the soft pronunciation of the letter. And then the second group there, the kind of harsher, more sort of negative kind of qualities there, those were associated with the hard pronunciation. And so there's associations there between like mercy, mercy and justice, or mercy and severity, like the two pillars in the tree. So yeah, again, good to be aware of these things and this sense of like a double expression, but we're not going to worry about how they correspond exactly with the letters or with the planets. Yeah, just move on. Okay, 7 doubles, Beth, Gimel, Daleth, Kaf, Pei, Resh, Tav. Up and down, east and west, north and south, and the holy palace precisely in the center, and it supports them all. See, Connor said, are there other translations of grace, ugliness? Seems like an unusual opposite pairing. Yeah, I don't know that they're necessarily exactly opposites. Like, I mean, some of them more or less are, but I don't know that the opposite of like dominance is subjugation. Yeah, I mean, some of the, I guess peace and war are pretty close to opposites. Wealth and poverty are pretty close to opposites. But grace and ugliness are the only. I can't think of any other translation of those words that I've ever seen, anyways. Yeah. Okay, so with the 6 directions, up, down, east, west, north, south, and the holy palace precisely in the center, and it supports them all. Okay, so now this is something that has been taken up into the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, and so we can talk about it a little bit. Now the attributions are again attributed just in order of the letters. So up is going to be attributed to Beth, down to Gimel, east to Daleth, west to Kaf, and so on. And then finally, the holy palace in the center will be attributed to Tav as the 7th thing. I believe all, at least major versions of the Sefer Yetzirah, keep this order the same, so people sort of agree generally on this point. One other thing else, well, actually, never mind, I'll say that for later. Let's see, Lex suggests perhaps beauty is most associated to grace, hence it being the opposite of ugliness. Yeah, I think that's a good thought. Yeah, certainly, and beauty would be a more conventional opposite to ugliness. I would say the sixth sephira on the tree, Tefereth, is beauty. So maybe they didn't, they were using a different word rather than reproducing the names of one of the sephiroth. I'm not sure. But I think grace is probably meant something, along the lines of beauty and harmony. Okay, so yeah, so like I was saying, the Hermetic Kabbalah tradition does use these directions. Let's see, I'll say something about the Holy Palace before we get into the directions specifically. So this idea of the Holy Palace being at the center, the word used for palace is, what is it? I wrote it down. Heko, spelled He, Yod, Kaf, Lamed. So it means palace, and it has a value of 65. The letters add to 65. And this is the same value as the word Adonai, which is a divine name attributed to Malkuth. And so the Kabbalistic interpretation of the word palace is often of the palace being referred to as Malkuth. And that actually fits very well. In the 7 double letters, it's being attributed to Tav, and Tav fits very well with Malkuth. They can both be attributed to Earth, and even Tav is also attributed to Saturn. Saturn is usually put in Binah, and Binah and Malkuth have a very deep and sort of complex relationship. So that sort of double attribution of Pallas, both to Tav and to Malkuth, works very nicely. Oh, that's a good question. Jason asked about, should we read into why there's a space between Daleth and Kaf? I'm trying to remember now. I actually did see some, I don't remember if it was in Arya Kaplan or somewhere else. Someone did mention that idea of them being split into like a group of 3 and a group of 4. And I'm actually not remembering what was said about it. It didn't seem to be particularly important, but that is a thing that does get talked about in the Hebrew tradition anyways, but not super relevant for us. Okay, right. So Pallas in the center. Now this holy palace, here it's called, Kaplan translated at a holy palace. You'll often see palace of holiness, I think, in a lot of kind of Golden Dawn derived sort of materials. It's just phrased that way. And then in some Kabbalistic texts, they also talk about it as the palace of the holy rather than palace of holiness. And the idea is that the holy is a reference to Kether. So Malkuth is like the palace of Kether, right? So the final manifestation on the tree is like the palace of the highest source. And so that is very nice as well, because you could kind of equally think of Kether being in the center of things as Malkuth. So you kind of get both in a way, which is very nice. Okay, and so I think I mentioned a little bit last week about the cube of space. And we talked about how Aleph, Mem, and Shin are attributed to the 3 sort of axes, where Aleph is the vertical axis, Mem runs from east to west, and Shin runs from north to south. So we can now add on these 6 directions of up, down, east, west, north, south, and center, and their attributions to the double letters. Let's see, Kristen asked a question here. She said, is Beth Gimel Daleth above Tefereth and Kaf Pei Resh Tav below? Let's see. Yes, that is true. Well, Kaf connects Hesed to Netzach. So Hesed is above, Netzach is below, so it's kind of right at the same level as Tefereth, I guess. But yeah, that's an interesting way of approaching that question. Okay, so here you're looking at least one version. This is the best version I could find quickly online of the cube of space. One thing that's a little bit weird here is that the 3 axes are attributed using the Hebrew letters, and then the double letters and single letters are instead given with their astrological equivalents. I'm not sure why that was done exactly. But let's see. I hope everybody can see my cursor here. I'm doing this a little bit differently than usual. Can you see my cursor? Okay. So, right. So here we've got this is the cube of space. Obviously this is the front face of the cube here, and then the back face of the cube. And then here in the middle, we've got the 3 axes or directions. So attributed to Aleph is the vertical axis here, right? Runs from the top to the bottom. Attributed to Mem, this is running from east to west. And then to Shin, running from north to south. And now we've got above, we've got the letter Beth, which we'll get into the planetary correspondences now. This is just the simplest, least confusing diagram I could find. So Beth, which is going to be attributed to Mercury, that's going to be the top face of the cube. Gimel, which is going to be attributed to the moon, is the bottom face of the cube. Our eastern face of the cube is going to be attributed to Daleth, and that's going to be attributed to Venus. The western face of the cube is Kaf, which is going to be Jupiter. The northern face of the cube is Pei, attributed to Mars. And the southern face of the cube is Resh, attributed to the sun. And then at the very center, we have Tav, the palace of holiness. I'm not sure if I mentioned this last week, but one nice kind of thing happens here was just that Tav, its primary correspondence is to the planet Saturn, but it has the secondary correspondence to Earth. And so if you think about Tav and its secondary correspondence, you've got the 3 axes of fire, water, and air. And the point where those 3 axes intersect is Tav, which is Earth in the secondary correspondence. And so that's really nice. We have this idea of Earth as the consolidation of the other 3 elements, and that works really beautifully in the cube of space. Okay, yeah, that's pretty much all I'm going to say about the cube of space. I think I know some people that are really interested in the cube of space and have used it a lot in their Kabbalistic work. It's never seemed incredibly useful to me, and I've never gotten a ton out of like the major books on it. I think it can be really interesting and useful for like practical ritual work. I think that either using it as when you're constructing rituals or using it as a way of analyzing pre-existing rituals can really reveal a lot, where you now have this way of associating all the different parts of your temple and all the different parts of space with these different things. So, you know, if you want to work with a particular planetary energy, you now have a direction that you can associate that with. You know, and like movement from north to south within your temple, you know, that could be somehow related to the letter Sheen and things like that. So it gives a nice set of ways of bringing these applications into, you know, into something that can be sort of used practically. Sunset in group rituals mostly. Yeah, group rituals, more complex rituals, especially ones where you've got, you know, multiple officers, things like initiation rituals and things like that. Those are often more useful. I don't know how much use you could really make out of, you know, using like the lesser ritual of the pentagram with the cube of space. I don't know that there would be really much there. But, you know, it's also a tool that you can use in designing your own rituals as well, if you wanted to. And then, you know, obviously now the 12 edges of the cube, those are attributed to the 12 single letters and to the 12 signs of the zodiac, but we're not going to worry about that today. Okay, so moving on with our Sefer Yetzirah here. 7 doubles, Beth, Gimel, Daleth, Kaf, Pei, Resh, Tav. 7 and not 6, 7 and not 8. Examine with them and probe with them. Make each thing stand on its essence, and make the creator sit on his base. This language of 7 and not 6, 7 and not 8, this echoes what part of the Sefer Yetzirah that we skipped over when it was talking about the Sephiroth. There was a bunch of repetitions of 10 Sephiroth, 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11. So this is just sort of repeating that language from earlier. Kaplan in his commentary talks about this idea of, it says examine with them and probe with them. He talks about the idea that the double letters could be thought of as like tools that we use in exploring the universe and or, you know, exploring reality. These are things that we use them to probe and to examine. So that was an interesting idea. Yeah, there's some sort of complex Kabbalistic stuff that you can do with the last 2 lines there about making each thing stand on its essence and the creator sit on his base. It's interesting, but not incredibly relevant. So I'm just going to move on. Okay, verse 6, 7 doubles, Beth, Gimel, Daleth, Kaf, Pei, Resh, Tav, of foundation. He engraved them, he carved them, he permuted them, he weighed them, he transformed them. And with them he formed 7 planets in the universe, 7 days in the year, 7 gates in the soul, male and female. Now, as I think I talked about last week, the grammar can be read in sort of 2 different ways. We can read it as this sort of third person, he engraved them, he carved them, or it could be read as imperative. So it's instructing you to engrave them, carve them, permute them, weigh them, transform them. And with them form 7 planets in the universe, 7 days in the year, 7 gates in the soul, male and female. So this could also be instructions in kind of meditational and magical technique. You know, engraving and carving, those are both ways of, I think, thought of as internal processes, ways of meditating on these things, of making them part of yourself, of ingraining them within yourself. Permuting them, we'll talk a little bit about some of the permutation techniques. That's sort of Kabbalistic techniques for working with them. You know, and then weighing and transforming, or sort of continuing along those lines. And you know, there's whole traditions that talk about all kinds of meditative techniques associated with this stuff. Okay, and then again, like last time, we saw how the 3 mother letters were placed in the universe, in the year, and in the soul. You know, in the universe, the 3 mother letters were like earth, heaven, and then the air between. In the year, they were winter and summer, and then Aleph was the kind of 2 temperate seasons of spring and fall between them. And then in the soul, they were the belly, the chest, and the head. So parts of the universe, parts of time, and then parts of the individual human being. And we'll see that again. All right, so now we go into a little more detail on that. 7 planets in the universe: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. 7 days in the year, the 7 days of the week. 7 gates in the soul, male and female. 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, and the mouth. Okay, so 7 planets in the universe. Nothing really surprising here. The order that they're given this is what's called Chaldean order. It's essentially what in a geocentric cosmology would be furthest out to closest. So Saturn would be the planet furthest away, and then Moon the closest. What it sort of more actually corresponds to is the time it takes, the orbital time. So Saturn moves the slowest, and the Moon is the fastest. There's actually some interesting kind of astronomical stuff where we might think that, other than the Moon, Venus or Mars would be our closest neighbor. But we actually spend more time out of the year, the Earth spends more time out of the year closer to Mercury than to any other planet. So there's actually a few, it doesn't work out exactly the same, but there's actually some nice astronomical, it's not as wrong as it might seem to be. But yeah, we'll talk a lot more about the planets in detail as we go on. Now, the way that the planet, as I think I mentioned in the maybe first and second classes, the way that the planets correspond with the letters, no surviving version of the Sefer Yetzirah does this in the same way that the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition does. And it's also the most variable in all the versions of the Sefer Yetzirah and in different Kabbalistic traditions. How the letters the 7 double letters get attributed to the 7 planets is more variable than anything else. The 7 days in the year, this also gets done in different and kind of complex ways in the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition. And so we'll look at both of these things, but we're not from a Sefer Yetzirah perspective, but just from what we actually use in the kind of Golden Dawn and Thelemic traditions. And finally, this last thing, 7 gates in the soul. Again, the male and female here refers to the soul. So it's both the male and the female soul. And so what's corresponding with the 7 letters is the 2 eyes, the 2 ears, the 2 nostrils, and the mouth. Either kind of the 7 like windows to the soul, the 7 like sensory apparatuses in the head. Again, these vary a lot in how they get attributed exactly, and they haven't really become major things in the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition, so we're not going to talk about them much. But we will talk about these 3 categories from a kind of Hermetic Kabbalistic perspective of universe, time, or year, and then also in the individual human being. So the next 7 chapters from here are now going to go through letter by letter and sort of spell out the exact correspondences. These 7 chapters were probably added at a later stage in the Sefer Yetzirah's development. Some of the earlier versions of like the short version don't even include them. So I'm just going to show you one just so that you can kind of get a flavor of what it's like. But these correspondences are not going to match the ones that we're going to use. And we're not going to look at the other 6. But just so you have some sense of what they're like. He made the letter Bet king over wisdom, and he bound a crown to it, and he combined one with another. And with them he formed the moon in the universe, Sunday in the year, the right eye in the soul, male and female. So we've got one of those 7 qualities that we saw at the beginning, attributed with each letter, and then also a planet and a day of the year. But like I said, this doesn't match our usage here. So I'm just going to move on. And we're going to skip verses 19 through 14, which just go through the next 6 letters and spell out the correspondences in the same way. So I'm just going to move on and just do the last 2 verses of Sefer Yetzirah, and then we can sort of dig into the way that we do the correspondences. All right, 7 doubles. Beth, Gimel, Daleth, Kaf, Pe, Resh, Tav. With them were engraved 7 universes, 7 firmaments, 7 lands, 7 seas, 7 rivers, 7 deserts, 7 days, 7 weeks, 7 years, 7 sabbaticals, 7 jubilees in the holy palace. Therefore, he made sevens beloved under all the heavens. All right, so these groups of seven here are all sort of some of them are specifically Kabbalistic ideas, like the seven universes. Others are things coming out of the Hebrew Bible, and other sort of Jewish traditions. We're not really going to dwell on any of them here, but just it's important that it's just being associated with all these different groups of seven. I also sometimes get the impression that maybe for some of the early Kabbalists or some of the early formation of this tradition, there was an idea about like groups of seven corresponding with other groups of seven, but there not being an emphasis on like lining up each individual thing with each other thing, so that like the seven double letters correspond with the seven C's, but there's not necessarily like this impulse to say which C corresponds with which letter. I know there's some more things I could say about that. There's a pattern in a lot of these, in like the Sefer Yetzirah, of the way that just the sort of the order that the things get listed in end up being the way that they're attributed to the letters, just like in alphabetical order. Though you might think that when it was originally being listed, it was just the group being listed and not necessarily like in an attributional order. But yeah, just something interesting. Okay, now last verse here of chapter 4. 2 stones build 2 houses. 3 stones build 6 houses. 4 stones build 24 houses. 5 stones build 120 houses. 6 stones build 620 houses. 7 stones build 5,040 houses. From here on, go out and calculate that which the mouth cannot speak and the ear cannot hear. Okay, so by stones here, we're talking about letters, and by houses, we're talking about words or permutations. One thing worth knowing about Hebrew is that because the Hebrew alphabet doesn't contain any vowels, there's a couple of like pseudo vowels, but essentially it contains no vowels. Hebrew words are just going to be written as like strings of consonants. Now, in modern Hebrew, you have a whole kind of vowel pointing system, but the letters themselves don't contain the vowels. And so what this means is that any string, there's no unpronounceable like strings of letters. Right. So like, in English, if you just have a string of consonants, you can't say that. But in Hebrew, you can say any string of letters by just filling in vowel sounds in between them. So when you're permuting out Hebrew letters, everything that you're going to get, even if whether it's like a word with a known meaning or not, will essentially be or could be thought of as a word because it could be pronounced. So the stones are letters, and the houses are words or like permutations, combinations of the letters. And so with 2 stones, with 2 letters, you can form 2 permutations. So, if the letters were Aleph and Beth, you can have Aleph Beth or Beth Aleph. Beth Aleph. Those are only 2 possibilities. With 3 letters, say the mother letters, Aleph Mem Shin, you could have 6 permutations, Aleph Mem Shin, Aleph Shin Mem, Mem Shin Aleph, Mem Aleph Shin, Shin Aleph Mem, Shin Mem Aleph. Right, so that's 6 possible things. With 4, you can get 24. With 5, you get 120. With 6, you get 620. And then with 7 letters, like the 7 double letters, there's 5,040 combinations. The math here is just like for 7, it's just 7 times 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 equals 5,040. So this is talking about actually going through these permutations as a kind of meditational or a magical technique. Now, to go through all 5,040 permutations of the 7 double letters, if you go at about 1 permutation every 5 seconds, this would take you about 7 hours. And so that is possible. I mean, it would be really difficult. You'd probably have to train and practice a lot, but it is possible. But if you were to add an 8th letter, you would then have more than 40,000 combinations, and that would take, let's see, what would that be? 56 hours, which is close to 2.5 days. And so this is where the mouth cannot speak and the ear cannot hear, is that with more than 7 letters, you're really beyond the limits of what humans are going to be able to do. There's one permutational technique where if you want to work with a certain letter and the powers associated with that letter, you go through all the permutations that begin with that letter. So like we want to work with the powers of Gimel, we could go through all the permutations that start with Gimel, and that's only going to take you about an hour rather than 7 hours. And so that's, again, difficult and would require practice, but it is possible. It's doable. Okay, so we're going to set the Sefer Yetzirah aside here and talk about the planets and the way that our tradition, has them correspond with the Hebrew letters. So in the left 2 columns there, I've got the Hebrew letter and then its English name. You'll notice again that I'm sort of spelling it the way I've sort of learned to spell it, which is a little bit different than the way that we saw Kaplan spelling it. But hopefully that's not too confusing. And like I said, you kind of need to get used to seeing alternate spellings or alternate transliterations of Hebrew words and letter names. And then we've got the planets, the in English name on the left, and then the glyph on the right. And then we've also got the path numbers. And this is also as we'll see in a few minutes, this is also like the line in 777 that you would look up. So Beth is the 12th path. Aleph is the 11th path. That's the first path after the 10 Sephiroth. Beth is the second letter, so it's the 12th path. Gimel is the third letter, so it's the 13th path. And then Tav is the last letter, so it's the 32nd path. All right, so the colors I've used here, as we'll talk about at the very end, there's a few different ways of associating the colors to there's actually a number of different ways of associating the colors to the planets. What I've used here, these are the king scale colors of the paths. So yellow is the king scale color for the 12th path. Blue is the king scale color for the 13th path, and so on. So that's what I'll be using throughout the presentation. Again, at the end, I'll mention like one other common one. So if you're looking at these and thinking that they're not quite right, like especially if you're thinking that the mercury should be orange rather than yellow, you're thinking of the other main set of color correspondences, which I'll talk about at the end. Okay, so I imagine most people here have a basic familiarity with the significances of the planets, through astrological study or, just through reading, magical books and things like that. But I just wanted to go through fairly briefly with some basic significances for the planets. Okay, so we'll just go in alphabetical order here. So Mercury, like the god Mercury and the god Hermes, the function of Mercury is as a messenger and a communicator. Mercury is associated with cleverness, specifically the kind of clever form of intelligence. The sun can also be associated with intelligence in a slightly different sense. Cleverness, language, calculation, analysis. These are all things associated with Mercury. The planet Mercury in its motion is fast and extremely variable. Mercury's speed is far more variable than any other planet. It goes retrograde more often. It's invisible more often, because by being so close to the sun, it can often not be seen. Especially in traditional forms of astrology, like in sort of Hellenistic, Arabic medieval, into Renaissance astrology, Mercury is very much has a kind of logic of both and neither. You'll often have kind of divisions into two, where the planets are divided into two groups, like the planets that are happier during the day and then the planets that are sort of happier during the night. That's called sect. And so you've got like 3 day planets, 3 night planets, and then Mercury, who's sort of neither, but can function as either one depending on various conditions. And then you'll have like the planets divided into the male and female planets. And then you've got Mercury, who's kind of neither male nor female, or sometimes seen as kind of hermaphrodite or androgynous. Same thing with the benefics and malefics. Mercury can be either benefic or malefic, or sort of neither, depending on conditions. So Mercury is constantly kind of evading binary logics. But there's also kind of a duality to Mercury. So Mercury has kind of a complicated relationship to duality. It kind of sets up dualities and is sort of dual in itself, but it resists being placed in like one place or the other in binaries. All right, and then we have the moon. So the moon rules things like growth and decline, also generation and corruption. And this sort of makes a lot of sense, right? The moon constantly is waxing and waning. So any type of kind of waxing and waning action could be thought of as lunar. So it's changeable and it's variable, but this is where instead of Mercury being kind of the messenger who's sort of all over the place, constantly changing forms, the moon is more about a cyclic kind of change. The moon is often associated with the tides. I mean, the moon actually, the gravitational force of the moon is what actually produces the tides, right? But the tides, that sort of inward and outward rhythm of the tides is a nice symbol for the moon. Moon is also usually considered to be receptive and reflective. The moon's light, of course, is reflected, and the other planet's light is reflected from the sun as well. But the moon especially has this quality of reflection and is thought to be receptive. Let's see, what else? The moon is associated with the non-rational, not necessarily the irrational, but just the non-rational, those forms of sort of thought and reason that aren't or thought and I don't know, that isn't sort of following reason, I guess, or rationality. Associated with the unconscious, with the body, with the needs and instincts, and so this can both be sort of your needs and your needs and sort of cravings and things like that, but it can also be about caretaking. So the moon can be a significator of like being a caretaker in like natal charts. It can refer to physical and emotional health, comfort. Where you're like what sign your moon is in your natal chart can often is often thought to like indicate where you find comfort and what makes you feel comfortable. So again, transience and change. The tides of generation and corruption. These are all very lunar things. Okay, so then moving on to Venus. Venus is just often described as being pleasant, sweet-smelling, beautiful. Venus has significances of attraction and pleasure, love and sex, romantic love, sexual love, or any other type of love as well. Could all be sort of Venusian things. Venus generally rules over the arts, so painting, poetry, music, dance. These are generally all seen as being ruled by Venus. So a lot of creativity, which the sort of fertility aspects are obviously related to the more creative aspects. Both of them are about producing something and giving birth to something, bringing something into being. Venus rules over relationships and especially like harmony in relationships. Venus is often seen as being kind, diplomatic, affectionate, and having the significance of concord and harmony, of making things harmonious. Of bringing things together, of harmonizing them. And you think like pleasure is often, I think I mentioned pleasure already, pleasure, attraction. So it's a kind of binding action, but a very pleasant one. All right, and then next we have Jupiter. Jupiter, good keywords for Jupiter are like expansion and elevation. Jupiter is sort of rules wisdom and is associated with wisdom. This can be wisdom in a more common sense, but if we also want to think about something like gnosis, that's something that we could also associate with Jupiter. Jupiter is optimistic. Religious figures and religious leaders, like being a priest or something like that, is something that Jupiter would be a kind of a significator for, or a priestess or whatever other tradition you're working in. Those are all kind of Jupiterian things. In the Indian astrology, the planet Jupiter is actually called Guru. They call it that. Again, that same association with spiritual teachers. Jupiter sort of talks about living according to principles. It's described as being majestic. It's associated with the sky, especially the clear blue, daytime sky. Not so much the night sky, but the just expansive, vast blueness of the sky. Jupiter sort of sees the unity in life and the kind of the totality. So similar in some ways to Venus, but sort of bigger and more abstract. Less about the sort of pleasures of daily life, things like that, and more about sort of bigger things about meaning and significance. Jupiter also rules health, prosperity, advancement, and growth. It'd be a little bit of a different type of growth than, Venus is more about sort of the moon is more about the cycles of like growth and decline. Jupiter is more about a kind of expanding or growing motion. All right, and then Mars, associated with the letter P. Mars's actions are often things like cutting and burning. Especially traditionally, Mars rules things like antagonism, strife, competition, though also things like courage and heroism. In more modern presentations of Mars, where it has a little less of the malefic quality, it's often given associations like dynamic energy or the strength of the body. And actually, even in traditional astrology, Mars was often a significator for athletes, partially, I think, for the competitive aspect of it too, but also just for the physical part of it. Metalworking is often associated with Mars, and Mars is definitely a very hot planet. So, the Greek god like Hephaestus or the Roman Vulcan are both very sort of martial figures because they're working with in transforming these heated metals. All right, and then the sun for the letter Resh. The sun is illuminating and animating. It's associated with intelligence, awareness, and spirit. Associated with identity, with the sense of self. It's rational, trying to read my own handwriting here, invigorating, leadership, abundance, health. It's life-giving. The warmth and light of the sun is life-giving. So whereas Mars, the heat of Mars sort of burns, and although it can be sort of productive in metalworking, it can also be quite destructive. But the sun is warm and life-giving rather than hot and scorching. The sun often is seen to sort of direct the energies, and again has that sort of leadership function. Often in your natal chart, the sun can have that kind of leadership quality. And in modern astrology, the sun sign has become the thing of most importance. Though even in traditional, it's right up to the top, if not number one. Prophecy is also associated with the sun. Apollo, for example, is a solar god, is very associated with prophets and oracles. All right, and then last we've got Saturn. Saturn is slow and heavy. Saturn rules over limits and limitations and binding. So a little bit like Venus in the sense of kind of bringing things together, but rather than being about attraction and harmony, this is more about binding, restriction, limitation. Saturn also rules things like structure. The bones in the physical body are often attributed to Saturn. So Saturn is kind of like the skeleton of things, the hard structure that everything else is built on. Saturn is steady, patient, sober, very responsible, and responsibility can be kind of Saturnian thing. Saturn rules death, but also agriculture. And so Saturn, is associated with the scythe, right? And actually the glyph of Saturn is kind of a stylized scythe. Right, and so the scythe is an agricultural implement, and so it reaps the grain, like the image of the grim reaper, reaping souls, right? And so that might seem a kind of negative thing, you're killing it and harvesting it, but that's how you get the grain to be able to eat it. So Saturn also has this very agricultural sense, especially with the sense of harvest. Saturn is also associated with time and with old age. It's seen as being cold and dark. Saturn is sometimes described as sad or dour, but it's also the wisdom of long experience. So a little bit of a different type of wisdom than Jupiter's wisdom. This is kind of the wisdom of, especially of old age, of having, sort of seen the ups and downs, felt the ups and downs of life. That type of wisdom is very Saturnian. Saturn is also described as being honest, and it's associated with asceticism. So whereas something more like a priest or a religious leader might be more of a Jupiterian figure, kind of a monk out in a cave somewhere is more of a Saturnian figure. Okay, so we'll talk about these all in more detail in the coming weeks when we look at the letters individually, but I wanted to give at least a kind of overview of the planets and some of their significances. And again, you'll see a lot of variation on the way that the planets are described, especially whether you're looking at more modern or traditional texts, different authors, different opinions, and things like that. But hopefully, that was a fairly general kind of set of characteristics that I went through there. Right, I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay, right. So here's from 777. So if we go back here, we'll see, the path numbers are the 12, 13, 14, 21, 27, 30, and 32. And then if we're looking at 777 and we want to know the planetary correspondences, those are the paths we'll look at. So if we want to know correspondences for Mercury, we'll look at the 12th path, the path of Beth. If we want to know correspondences for the moon, look at the 13th path, the path of Gimel. And you'll see that the way that Crowley is arranged, the 22 letters there, from 11 down to 32, the mother letters are kind of justified to the left. The double letters, the planets, the ones that we're talking about, are in the center. And then the single letters associated with the zodiac signs are on the right. So you can see how 12, 13, 14, 21, 27, 30, and 32 are kind of right down the middle there. And that makes it a little bit easier to read. Okay, yeah, so let's continue with the idea of these planets in the universe. So again, I mentioned this idea of Chaldean order, which I'm not sure if I said it back on the other slide, but that's also in the Jewish tradition. The Chaldean order is also the order in which the planets were said to be created. So God created Saturn first, then Jupiter, then Mars, then the Sun, then Venus, then Mercury, and then the Moon. So that same ordering works both in the more Hermetic tradition coming out of like Hellenistic astrology, and then also in the Jewish tradition as well. So here we've got one kind of model of the geocentric cosmology. So in the center here, I think I used this same slide back in the first class. In the center here, we've got the realm of the four elements, and then above it, the moon, the sphere of the moon, right? Again, in the geocentric cosmology, the planets were thought to kind of revolve on these like spheres that are all nested inside of each other. So the sphere of the moon, and then beyond that, Mercury, and then beyond that, the sphere of Venus, then the sphere of the Sun, then the sphere of Mars, then the sphere of Jupiter, then the sphere of Saturn. And now this is sort of breaking up in a little bit of a different way here, but usually we talk about after that being the sphere of the fixed stars, the sphere of the zodiac, and then beyond that being kind of like the realm of divinity. So yeah, this is important for thinking about them in the universe. And it seems like the Sefer Yetzirah is thinking about them in a similar way by giving them in that order. So we sometimes see, obviously we're most familiar with seeing like the tree of life kind of diagrams that lay out the Sephiroth, but we can also see them on in a kind of model of concentric circles, which ends up looking very much like this geocentric cosmology model that we just saw. And so you've got the kingdom, that's Malkuth, right in the center, and then the Sephiroth kind of outwards from there. Although obviously in terms of creation, we're moving from the out in. So the crown, that's Kether. That would be like what Aristotle calls like the unmoved mover, the first cause, the uncaused cause. And then moving inwards, the Sephiroth, wisdom, that would be Hokmah, that would be the sphere of the fixed stars. And then the next 7 down correspond to the spheres of the planets. And then in the center, we've got the earth, the kingdom, Malkuth. And so on that pattern, that's how the planets get attributed to the tree of life. So these are the attributions that Agrippa uses, and these are the main ones that we still use in the Hermetic tradition for associating the Sephiroth with the planets. Again, the paths, also, like the path of Beth is here. So Mercury would also be like here, on the paths, but we're just talking about the Sephiroth here. And so we can see that they're arranged kind of from top down. This would be the sphere of the first cause, the divine. Then here we have the zodiac and the fixed stars. And then descending down the tree, we've got Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, the moon, and then this would be Earth at the bottom in Malkuth. Okay, so again, that's what's called Chaldean order, starting from Saturn, from the furthest one out, the slowest planet, moving to the closest and the fastest planet of the moon. Okay, so here I've kind of rearranged the same chart you saw before to again show that Chaldean order. And again, you'll see that this isn't alphabetical order or even reverse alphabetical order. This is just a different ordering based on the planets. Yeah, and always starting with Saturn. Sometimes I think, especially in sort of magical work. You'll sometimes see them ordered like from Moon, Mercury, Venus, going upwards to Saturn. That's obviously the same order, but working in more of like an ascensional model rather than a kind of creation-based model, I suppose, which is what this more is. Okay, so that's the planets in the universe. And now we can move on to talk about the planets in the year. So again, this is different than the way the Jewish tradition does it. And so we're just not even going to get into the way that they do things. Although they do also use the system that we're going to talk about now. So we're going to talk about now is the planetary days and hours. So this is a way of attributing hours and then from hours up to days to the 7 planets. So hours here is not clock hours, and they're not always going to be 60 minutes. In fact, they usually won't be 60 minutes. The first hour, so you're looking at kind of a chart of the day here. Obviously, you can see sunrise and sunset are marked there. So the first hour begins at sunrise, and the first hour of the day, or the daytime, begins at sunrise, and then the first hour of the night begins at sunset. And then those 2 periods, from sunrise to sunset, that's the daytime, and from sunset to sunrise, that's the nighttime, obviously. Those 2 periods are then each divided into 12 equal periods. So at the equinox, these will all be approximately 60 minutes and approximately the same length. The math still gets complicated because the time of sunrise changes every day and so on. But as we approach the summer solstice, the daytime is going to get longer and the nighttime will get shorter. And so the day hours will get longer and the night hours will get shorter. And then in the winter, the opposite happens. So on the winter solstice, the night hours are as long as they ever are and the day hours are as short as they ever are. So what's going to happen is that the hours are going to be attributed to the planets in Chaldean order. So if we start with the first hour at Saturn, our second hour will be Jupiter, our third hour will be Mars, our fourth hour will be the Sun, fifth hour Venus, sixth hour Mercury, seventh hour the Moon, and then the eighth hour will just go back to Saturn again. And so that planet rules over that hour, and its influence is thought to be stronger in that hour. And doing magical work related to that planet is thought to be more effective in that hour. And so that just sort of revolves all the way around. And so because there's 7 planets, but 24 hours, and 24 doesn't divide evenly into 7, and it's just going to sort of keep going all the way around. So again, if we start with Saturn as the first hour, eventually let's see, I think it'll be the 10th hour of the night will be, is that right? The 10th hour of the night will be back to Saturn again. And then the 11th hour will be Jupiter. The 12th hour will be Mars. And then the first hour of the next day will be the Sun. So each day will start with another planet. And the hours just continually go in Chaldean order without any interruption for the day or night changeovers. So this will then revolve, and each day, over the course of 7 days, each day will start with a different planet. And so the tradition developed that the planet who rules the first hour of the day, that's the hour beginning with dawn, that planet is sort of ruler over the entire day. Now, in the Hebrew tradition, the days don't start at dawn; they start at sunset. And that's still true. The Saturday is the Jewish Sabbath, and that starts at what we call sundown. On what we would call Friday. So their days run sunset to sunset. Our days obviously our civil days run midnight to midnight. But in sort of the Hellenistic tradition, they ran dawn to dawn. Using sunset as the beginning of your day makes it easier to use your lunar calendars are more accurate because you can more precisely judge which day it is right after the new moon if you can see the moon just after sunset. I won't explain that, but it makes lunar calendars easier. Okay, so then one more thing I want to say before I move on. So there developed a second tradition because the planet ruling at dawn didn't make sense. If you think days start at sunset, developed a tradition of there being a separate day and a night ruler, so that the planet ruling in the first hour of day rules that daytime period, and then the planet ruling the first hour of night rules the night. So each planet only rules for 12 hours rather than for 24. Okay, so what happens? This chart here, I got this from Christopher Warnock's website, which is Renaissance Astrology, I think .com. But he's a great astrologer and astrological magician, and I stole this chart here from him. So you're looking at the hours numbered sort of vertically here, the day hours from 1 to 12, and then the night hours from 1 to 12 below them. So each column is one day. So on the left, we see Sunday, first the 12 daytime hours, and then below that, the 12 nighttime hours. And so you'll see that, again, we're just going in Chaldean order, starting with the sun, and then after we get to the moon, wrapping back around to Saturn. And then, the 12th hour of the day is Saturn, so then the first hour of the night is Jupiter, and then the 12th hour of the night is Mercury, so the first hour of the next day is going to be the moon, and so we just continually revolve in Chaldean order. And you'll see that the names of the planetary rulers actually, our language actually still continues this tradition. So the day that begins today, for example, beginning with the sun, is where the first hour that began at dawn this morning was ruled by the sun, and so this is Sun Day. The sun presides over this day. Then tomorrow, the first hour will be the moon, and so that will be the moon's day, or Monday. Now on the day after that, the first hour will be Mars, and so Mars will rule that day. Now we call that day Tuesday because the Germanic god Tu is the Germanic equivalent to the Roman Mars, so that is Tuesday or Mars's day. You see, in French, Tuesday is Mardi, right? Mars Day. So a lot of the Romance languages preserve the actual name of the planets, where because of the Germanic background of English, some of the god names got changed to their Germanic equivalents. So Wednesday is ruled over by Mercury. Now the Germanic equivalent to Mercury is Odin or Woden, so that's Woden's day, Wednesday. That's an interesting correspondence that might not be immediately obvious why Odin would be Mercury. A lot of that has to do with his invention and use of the runes. He might seem like more of a Jupiterian figure, but the Romans associate him with Mercury. And then Thursday, that's Thor's day. Thor corresponds with Jupiter here. So Thursday is Jupiter's day or Thor's day. And then Friday is Venus's day. And some sources give the idea that that the Fry in Friday is the goddess Frigg, and others say Freya. But in either case, whichever goddess it is just being sort of syncretized to Venus. And then Saturday is Saturn's day. And then obviously you also have the sequence of nighttime rulers as well. So the ruler for starting at sundown tonight. Well, depending on where you are, it's afternoon here in California. But sundown on Sunday begins the hour of Jupiter, and so Jupiter rules Sunday night, and then Venus rules Monday night, and so on. But it's the days that give us the names of the days. Okay, so here's a kind of cool little trick here. We've got a heptagram, or one version of the heptagram it is. You can draw the heptagram in two different ways. So what we've got here is the planets arranged in Chaldean order, starting from the top and just going clockwise. So again, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. But if we trace the line along the heptagram, so starting with Saturn, we'll follow the line of heptagram to the Sun, to the Moon, to Mars, to Mercury, to Jupiter, to Venus, and then back to Saturn again, we get the orders of the days of the week. So that's Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And then back to Saturday, of course, again. Now that obviously just sort of falls out of the math because when you divide 24 by 7, you get a remainder of 3. So that just sort of naturally gives this pattern. There's a few other interesting patterns that you can get by arranging the planets on the heptagrams, but we don't really have time to go into it now. But it's a fun thing to kind of play with, draw the different versions of the heptagrams, and then arrange the planets around them. You can go in Chaldean order, order by day of the week, order by sort of days and nights, and then look at different patterns that you get by tracing the heptagram in different ways. So fun thing to play with. Okay, so to talk about the 7 planets or the 7 double letters in the soul, like I said, that idea of using like the 2 eyes, the 2 nostrils, the 2 ears, and the mouth isn't really a part of our tradition. So I was trying to think of something that would be kind of equivalent and that would show the planets, in the sort of subtle body of the individual human. And so this probably isn't the only thing that we could talk about here, but one way we talk about it is the 7 chakras. So a couple things here. First thing to know is that the colors here I'm using, I'm just using the colors based on the planets. I'm not attributing these colors to the chakras. Yeah, and actually, the kind of modern Western version of like yogic anatomy, where the lowest like chakra is red, and then that sort of goes up the rainbow scale until the crown chakra, Sahasrara, is violet. I think that color scheme actually doesn't work very well. It's not a traditional Indian color scheme. But yeah, so these are the ways that the planets get attributed to them. So you have like Muladhara at the bottom, that's attributed to Saturn. Unfortunately, I assume most of you are at least vaguely familiar with this system. We don't have time to go through it in any kind of detail. And then Svadhisthana, our second chakra here, is associated with Mars. And Manipura is associated with Jupiter. Anahata, the heart chakra, is associated with the sun. Vishuddhi, the throat chakra, is associated with Venus. The Ajna, the third eye chakra, is associated with the moon. And then Sahasrara, the crown chakra, the 1,000-petaled lotus, is associated with Mercury. Yeah, so just that's one way that we can talk about the planets being sort of present in the individual human or in the soul is as these 7 energy centers up the spine. I think every time I mention the chakras, I always feel compelled to say that it's important to realize that this is kind of a Western interpretation of the Eastern system. For one thing, like Sahasrara, the crown, what we call the crown chakra, wasn't usually considered to be a chakra. It was sort of something else. And also the exact number and names and positions, the colors and other associations with the chakras change a lot. There's grouping of like 12 chakras. There's sets of 5. And I think actually in the Tibetan tradition, I think they still use the 5. So they're very variable. They're also seen as something that are sort of constructed by practice. I'm trying to remember, I read an essay about this. I can't remember the name of the author now. But the idea is that the chakras are a thing that you build up through concentration and through exercises, not things that are just kind of like naturally, inherently part of the human system, but something that's actually constructed by the spiritual practitioner. I just think that's something sort of interesting and important to be aware of. Okay, so last thing here, or maybe second to last thing, I talk about this alternate scheme of color associations. So the colors I was showing you earlier was what's called the king scale that corresponds to the world of Atsaluth, and that's for the individual paths. For those are the colors corresponding with the letters. Now there's also colors that we can talk about corresponding with the Sephiroth. Now again, the letters and the Sephiroth all have 4 different color scales. There's also lots of other traditions associating with the colors with the planets. The Zohar has its own set of color correspondences. Other kind of traditional astrological magic has its own set. So there's lots of different color correspondences to planets. But I just wanted to show you kind of the 2 main ones that you'll see in the kind of Golden Dawn and Thelemic traditions. So like I said, you've already seen the king scale path attributions. But you'll also see attributions based on the queen scale attributions of the Sephiroth. And usually when you see a colored tree of life, what you're seeing is you're seeing just a single color attributed to each path and Sephira. You're seeing the Sephira in the queen scale and the paths in the king scale. And the idea there, at least the way I've heard it explained, was that the Sephiroth, they're supposed to be receptive And so they're the queen scale, corresponding with like the He of Tetragrammaton. And the paths are supposed to be more active and more kind of projective of energy. So they correspond with the king scale, which would be like the Yod of Tetragrammaton. So we're looking at, well, more or less the queen scale colors to the Sephiroth. The one thing I didn't actually do was Malkuth here should really be the 4 colors of citrine, olive, russet, and black. But I was lazy and just used black by itself. But that's not really going to matter for our purpose here. But I just want you to notice the pattern of the other 9 Sephiroth here. So in our supernal triad of Kether, Hokmah, and Bina, we've got white, gray, and black. And then our next triad down of Hesed, Gevurah, and Tefereth. These are the 3 primary colors of blue, red, and yellow. And then the third triad here is of Netzach, Hod, and Yesod are the secondary colors of green, orange, and purple. Yeah, a bunch of sort of interesting things we could say about this. One thing to note is that the way that the patterns, that the secondary colors are sort of generated. So green here is the product of yellow, and mixing yellow and blue together like gives you green. And then mixing, red and yellow together gives you orange. So you can see how the colors are, connected in the way that they're mixed. And then violet here for Yesod is the mixture of red and blue. And so the way they're colored actually nicely shows the actual structure and relationships between the Sephiroth. And again, like I said, Malkuth should actually be the 4 colors of citrine, olive, russet, and black, but I didn't do that. So now if we put our planets back onto our tree, like we saw a minute ago, you'll see that Saturn, attributed to Binah, will be associated with black. Jupiter will be associated with blue. Mars will be associated with red. The sun will be yellow. And I forgot to change the color of the sun glyph there. I should have changed that to violet to be the opposite. I was just trying to use opposite complementary colors again, but I forgot to switch that one over. What was I saying? Venus for Netzach would be green. Mercury in Hod is orange. And then the moon in Yesod is purple. So we now have 2 different color scales. So the one on the left, the king scale path, the one I've been using most of the time, and the one on the right, the Sephirothic attributions, are the one I just showed you. So if you kind of squint your eyes at this a little bit, you'll see that they're not quite as different as they might immediately seem. Venus and Mars are the same. They're green and red in both. One thing that's changed is that Saturn has gone from being indigo to being black. Indigo is a spectrum color, not a primary or secondary. So here it's black. And again, because it was not part of the 2 other triads, it was part of the supernal triad, so it got the black color. You'll also see the other changes have been, so Mercury has gone is either yellow or orange, and the sun is either orange or yellow. The moon is either blue or purple, blue or purple. And then I didn't distinguish between purple and violet here. We're just not going to worry about that. And then Jupiter is either sort of violet or blue. So you can see that yellow and orange are quite close to each other, and blue and violet are quite close to each other. And we can also see that the opposite or complementary planets remain the same. So in our king scale path, yellow is the opposite of purple. And so that's Mercury and Jupiter. And then in our Sephirothic colors, we have orange and blue, which are also opposites. So the same kind of sets of complements stay the same. Obviously, Mars and Venus stay the same. They stay the same color. And then the moon and the sun are also complementary colors of either blue or orange or purple or yellow. And then in both, Saturn just sort of doesn't fit in. Saturn is either indigo, which doesn't have an opposite represented in the other planets, or it's black. And those opposites, the opposites of like Mercury and Jupiter, Mars and Venus, those are the opposites in planetary rulership around the zodiac. So, like Aries is ruled by Mars, and directly opposite to it on the zodiac is Libra, which is ruled by Venus. So again, using traditional rulerships, not using like, Neptune and Pluto, all the any sign, ruled by Mars is going to be opposite to a sign ruled by Venus, and vice versa. Signs ruled by Mercury are opposite to signs ruled by Jupiter. Virgo is opposite to Pisces, and Gemini is opposite to Sagittarius. And then the sun and moon are sort of used as opposite here. That actually sort of breaks the pattern a little bit, because actually the two signs ruled by the sun and moon are opposite to the two signs ruled by Saturn, right? Cancer and Leo are opposite to Capricorn and Aquarius. But for the others, not sort of including the luminaries of the sun and moon kind of make their own pair, and then Saturn isn't sort of included here. But you can see at least some of the pattern that gets preserved in both. All right, and then last thing for correspondences here before we break. We're just out of time, but we did start a little late, so we're right about an hour and a half. I just wanted to show you the 7 metals. Now, there's different versions of this, different alchemical texts. You'll see slight variations, but these are the main ones that you'll see. Like in 777, these are the ones that you'll see. So to Mercury is, surprise, Mercury. To the moon, we get silver. For Venus, we have copper. For Jupiter, we have tin. For Mars, we have iron. For the sun, we have gold. And for Saturn, we have lead. These all have the nice benefit of all being actual elements. None of these are alloys or compounds. A lot of these make just sort of really obvious, intuitive sense. Silver and gold to the sun and the moon are incredibly obvious, especially if you've ever seen, like in a public square somewhere in Europe or something like that, or anywhere else, like large statues and things like that are entirely covered in gold foil in the sun. You can see how incredibly luminous gold really is. It's, sort of encountering that, you think, it's extremely solar. Silver in the moon, that sort of makes a lot of sense. Obviously, Mercury is extremely reasonable. Lead, of course, is an extremely heavy and dark-colored metal, so that corresponds well with Saturn. And again, like I said, you will see some variations, like you'll see bronze for Venus sometimes, but bronze is a copper alloy. Sometimes you'll see different forms of bronze in different places. So there is some variation, but these are our main attributions to the metals. Okay, so I was thinking about also talking about some of the hierarchies, especially the angelic, the hierarchies of angels, planetary angels, planetary intelligences, and planetary spirits. But that gets extremely complex, especially when you start talking about 777, which is really not organized in an easy to use way when we're talking about like planetary hierarchies. So I'm going to save that for later. And when we talk about the individual, when we go through in alphabetical order, I'll talk about the hierarchy for each individual thing. And maybe I'll find an easy way of explaining the really confusing way that's laid out in 777. But if you want an easier, better source for planetary hierarchies, I really recommend Jim Eshelman's 776.5. He lays it out in a very, very sensible and easy to use order. Like you can get your planetary angel, your planetary intelligence, your planetary spirit all laid out on a single page. Really easy to read and work with. But again, we'll come back to that later. So I guess that covers everything that I wanted to talk about, I think. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I'm happy to hang out for a few more minutes if people want to talk about anything. In the meantime, I'll look over my notes and see if there's anything else I wanted to say that I forgot. No, I think I pretty much covered it. Again, we'll be going. This is sort of kind of an introduction to the groupings of the letters. We'll be going over all of these in a lot more detail individually. We'll be talking about the tarot cards and other associations, things like the individual, like gemstones, incenses, and stuff like that. We'll talk about that all when we go through them individually. I was trying to show things that make sense when you see them as a group, whereas things like kind of gemstones and incenses, you don't necessarily need to see them grouped into like mothers, letters, and singles. So I was just trying to show you the logic of the groupings here in these classes. All right, thanks everybody. Here, let me go into my contact slides here. So for more info about our work, you can visit tots.org, and you can specifically go to tots.org/FAQ. There's a whole frequently asked questions there. A lot of information about both our academic and initiatory tracks, the type of work that's included in them, how to make an application, things like that. Now, there's my personal email there. You're welcome to contact me. If you just want to talk about anything about the class or anything else, you had any kind of questions that you wanted to follow up on. But I can also add you to our public Google group where we send out, I send out announcements for new class series, and other instructors will be sending out announcements for class series as well. So if you want to be added to the Google group, there is a link that you can use, but it was sort of too long and complicated to paste in here. So you can just email me and I can add you to the group. In future notifications about classes and things like that, I'll include that link in those things. And then also, there's a $5 suggested donation for anyone who's not a member via the academic track or the initiatory track, and you can send that via PayPal to payments@tots.org. So yeah, thanks everybody. I hope that was useful. And next week, we'll be finishing off with our kind of partial tour through Sefer Yetzirah and our groups of the letters. And we'll talk about the single letters and the signs of the zodiac. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll jump into the final sequence of looking at, I'll just sort of go through an alphabetical order and look at all the letters again, their correspondences, and especially the tarot trumps and other symbolism there. So yeah, if there's no questions or anything like that, I will go ahead and stop the recording.